Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Kimball Art Museum. I'm George Shackelford, Deputy Director, and it's on behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff and our director, Eric Lee, who unfortunately is not here this evening. He's not feeling very well. We are very, very happy to welcome you here to the last of the lectures in connection with the exhibition Bonnard's Worlds, which closes, I will remind you, on the 28th of this month. So you could come every day between now and then, except Sundays. And I would recommend it, as a matter of fact. I think it would not be time ill spent. It has been such a pleasure working on Bonnard for the last 5 years or so, and one of the people whose work on Bonnard I have touched back on again and again and again is Sarah Whitfield, who is going to speak to us tonight. Sarah is an independent art historian working in London, based in London, and has worked on a wonderful number of artists of the 20th century, including most particularly Bonnard, for whom she organized a retrospective exhibition that was at Tate and the Museum of Modern Art in 1998, organized with her friend and mine, John Elderfield, and also with the great English art historian David Sylvester. She was the co-organizer of a major exhibition about René Magritte, the surrealist, Belgian surrealist painter, which was in London, Paris, New York, and Houston, I believe, and maybe Chicago. Chicago, that's right, in 1992. The last time the great three bathers that conclude our exhibition were shown together in the United States was in Sarah's exhibition in 1998. But she has contributed to the catalogs of other exhibitions of Bonnard, including a wonderful one at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris in Paris, needless to say, in 2006, and essays on Bonnard for catalogs at the Aquavella Galleries, most recently last year, and on Freud and Bonnard in 2002, I believe is the right year, as well as writing wonderful reviews of other people's Bonnard exhibitions over the course of time. I specifically wanted to ask Sarah to come and speak to us about the life and the story, the question, the problem, really, of Marthe Bonnard, about whom so much is said and about whom so little has been conclusively known. And I know that Sarah has gone to the archives. She's gone back to work on this project for this lecture tonight and has discovered quite a lot of new information. Please do come down. It's just me talking. Don't stand in the back. Nobody's going to be offended if you walk down. Find a nice seat. There's almost a whole row right up here at the front. And she will be speaking to us tonight on Marthe Bonnard, Myths and Truths. So won't you welcome Sarah Whitfield?
Thank you, George, very much. And thank you particularly for inviting me here to this great museum. It's long been my wish to be here to see the wonderful collection. And this time, of course, I get the Bonnard exhibition as well. And I have to say, I have seen quite a few Bonnard exhibitions, but when you come out of an exhibition feeling that the artist is even better than you thought he was, then you know that exhibition has done its job. And that's what George has done, I think, here. So little is known about Marthe Bonnard's life that it's hardly surprising that all sorts of stories, I think I've lost my, oh, here we are. All sorts of stories and half-truths about her have proliferated over the years. This hasn't been helped by a wall of discretion erected by Bonnard's heirs. And of course, there's nothing like discretion for breeding fictions and half-truths. Mart's own obscurity has only added to the mystery of who she really was. And what isn't known or can't be known can always be made up. Indeed, it's fair to say that over the past 20 years or so, Mart's anonymity has given rise to a whole new industry of romantic fiction, the most recent of which is Martin Provost's film, released in May last year. That is the myth, and that is the reality. As it happens, the myths and fictions begin with Marthe herself. When Marthe met Bonnard in 1893 on a Paris street, well, that's what we're told. Nobody's actually proved that. She told him she was 16 and her name was Marthe de Méligny. In fact, she was 24, and her name was Maria Boursin. She was around 5'2", slim, an auburn blonde with blue eyes. What she didn't tell Bonnard was the following: that she was born on the 22nd of February, 1869, in Saint-Amand-Montrond, a small town 20 miles southeast of the cathedral city of Bourges, the fourth child of a carpenter, Aimable Boursin, and a dressmaker, Honorine Métainier. Two older brothers, Aimable and Georges, died in infancy. Two older sisters, Marie-Espérance and Aline, died before Marthe was 17. A younger sister, Adèle, was born in 1871, and a brother, Aimable, named after both his father and the deceased brother, was born in 1874. So while Marthe told Bonnard, and presumably everyone she met thereafter, that she had no family, two of her younger siblings were very much alive, her sister Adèle and her brother Aimable. Her mother, Honorine, who lived well into her 90s, died in 1927 when Marthe was 58. We have no record of any communication between, this is Honorine, between Marthe and her mother. But according to her great niece, Pierrette Vernon, Marthe kept in touch with her sister Adèle and Adèle's eldest daughter, Gabrielle, through occasional meetings in Paris with their mother. Marthe also wrote to and received postcards from Adèle or Gabrielle, always addressed to Boursin Méligny at various post-restaurant addresses around France. These communications appear to have stopped after the death of her mother, but they hint at a closer relationship with her family than previously assumed. Honorine had moved to Paris sometime before 1886, when she's recorded as living at 30 Rue Milton. Marthe, as far as we know, was working in a shop, possibly the high-end artificial flower shop Trousselier in the Boulevard Haussmann, making floral decorations and funerary wreaths. As the shop was about a 10-minute walk from where her mother was living, it's possible Marthe had been living with her mother before she met Bonnard. But from the moment they met, Marthe became her own creation. She had no past, no story, at least no story she was prepared to share. Apart from a few photographs taken around 1902, we know almost nothing about her. Before around 1915, when she jumps out at us in this rather startling photograph. It's a very carefully posed portrait, and Marthe has taken great care about her appearance. She's elegant and sophisticated, and at ease in front of the camera. When I was first shown this photograph last summer by Véronique Serrano, the director of the Musée Bonnard at Le Canet, it changed my perception of her. I had always imagined Marthe as she had been seen through the eyes of others, those who had known her when she was already over 40 and beginning to show signs of the illnesses, both physical and mental, that would dominate both her life and Bonnard's. The Mart that looks out at this photograph with such confidence is a very different one from Bonnard's friends would describe in later years, long after she had died. We meet her first in Reverie, a lithograph of 1893, and a small painting on wood, The Cup of Coffee, dated 1894. And over the next few years, she's the focus of a series of very intimate, sensual paintings and drawings. These early depictions of Mart, for their time extraordinarily intimate, lay the foundations of so much that followed. It was through Mart that Bonnard first explored the subject of the nude, a subject he hadn't attempted before their meeting, and which he made completely his own by transposing the nude from the conventional mix of the classical and the erotic into a subject about as everyday as a bowl of fruit. Not even Degas, with his images of women at their morning washing routines, could capture the casual intimacy that Bonnard brings to the subject. So casual, we don't immediately comprehend its originality. The famous series of nude photographs taken by Bonnard around 1901 in the garden at Montval outside Paris, where he and Mart had rented a house, show Bonnard already establishing his practice of instructing his model to act as though unaware of being observed. If he was in need of a particular pose, he would frequently turn to Greek or Roman sculpture. And you could say that he combines the monumentality of the classical Aphrodite with the informality of the everyday. And you will have noticed how the faces of his nudes are almost always turned away. This is another set of photographs, this time in their apartment, I would imagine. Unlike the inviting attitudes of Goya's Mayas or Manet's Olympia, for example, Bonnard's nudes are not on display, nor do they play to the provocative sensuality of a Boucher nude or the lushness of a Renoir odalisque. Those Boucher and Renoir were two of Bonnard's favorite painters, by the way. From very early on, Bonnard was faithful to the aesthetic of the poet Stéphane Mallarmé, an aesthetic summed up in Mallarmé's often quoted instruction: to name an object is to destroy 3/4 of the pleasure we take in it, which is derived from the enjoyment of guessing by degrees of suggestion. Bonnard's depictions of Mart follow this lesson. She becomes a motif to which he returns constantly as he gives shape to his experience of her over time. It may be helpful to think of his relationship to her as comparable to Cézanne and his paintings for the Mont Sainte-Victoire, or Monet and his lily pond. As Bonnard scribbled down in his pocket diary on the 3rd of July, 1935, there is the model that is there in front of you and the model that is in the head. Infusing what was immediately to hand with imagination, invention, and memory is the key to Bonnard's way of working, as indeed it had been for both Cézanne and Monet. I'm not sure if you can see, but there is the inscription that he has written in French, obviously. In those early years, Mart seems to have fitted easily into the life Bonnard had dreamed of as a young law student. As he later admitted, it wasn't so much art that had attracted him, it was the artistic life, with all that I thought it meant in terms of free expression, of imagination, and the freedom to live as one pleased. What he desired above all was to escape the monotonous life of a civil servant his family had mapped out for him. By 1891, he was living the life he'd always wanted, exhibiting at the Salon des Indépendants after attracting the admiration of Toulouse-Lautrec with his poster, France Champagne. And his circle now included not only his fellow painters, but all those who keep the wheels of art turning such as collectors and critics, art dealers, magazine editors. He'd found a world ideally suited for his talents and for himself. And now he'd found the ideal companion and model. Or perhaps collaborator would be a better word, because I think you see in those photographs I showed you that there is a sort of collaboration between Bonnard and Mart about how she's going to be depicted. Bonnard came from the comfortably off, cultured haute bourgeoisie. His father had an important position at the War Ministry and had inherited family property in the Dauphiné, where the family came together for their holidays. So what did his family think about their son living openly with a young woman from Mart's background? Antoine Terrasse, Bonnard's great-nephew, told me that he and his brothers were first told about Mart when he was 17, which may not be entirely accurate, as photographs taken in 1902 have since come to light that show Mart with Bonnard's brother Charles, which is on the left, his wife Eugénie in the middle, and Mart is on the right. And here we see her at the same place with a horse. And I show this slide because I think one of the most sort of things that they had in common right from the start was a great love of animals. And Mart is often seen with the dog and the cat, but here she is with the horse. Later, in a photograph taken in 1913, we see Bonnard and Mart with his sister's family enjoying a meal in the garden of the large family house in the Dauphiné, apparently recording the moment when she was introduced to the wider family. Again, there's no corroboration that this was the first time she'd met Bonnard's family. But if this was so, it would have been some 20 years after they'd first met. Each spring and autumn, Bonnard would spend a few weeks at the family property. These were family gatherings with his brother Charles, their sister André, and his brother-in-law Claude Terrasse. Before 1913, Mart, one assumes, had been left behind in Paris. Theirs was a rather simple, austere lifestyle. A friend who knew the couple later in life said that they shared a fondness for discomfort. Bonnard, who disliked the trappings of middle-class life, always preferred a sparse way of living. For instance, in 1943, when life was particularly harsh under the German occupation, with very little heating and severe food rationing, Matisse, who was living rather more comfortably in nearby Nice, suggested Bonnard, now a widower, vacate his small cold house in Le Canet and check into a smart hotel in Nice. Bonnard was appalled at the idea, telling his friend it was the clientele of those hotels as much as the surroundings that he couldn't stand. However, a few luxuries were allowed, a car, for instance, which Bonnard could not have lived without. Such was his passion for touring around the French countryside. And he was to own several cars, including a Model T Ford. For all I know, that might be a Model T Ford. A plumbed-in bath, of which more later. Central heating, observe the white radiators in many of his later interiors. And by the 1920s, Mart is seen from time to time wearing a string of pearls and what looks like an expensive fur coat. Bonnard's friends shared his disregard for the strict social conventions of the day. Both Matisse and Signac had lived openly with their first partners, who were both from the same social class as Mart. For example, Signac only told his mother he was living with his friend Berthe 9 years after they'd met. If he had hesitated to introduce Mart to his parents, she nonetheless became very much part of his immediate circle. Bonnard asked his very close friend Vuillard to paint Mart's portrait, which he kept to the end of his life. And we see her here much later with Vuillard and Bonnard in a photograph probably taken in the 1920s. We also get the impression that some of Bonnard's friends found Mart a little sharp, Vuillard especially. For instance, in 1907, the year he painted the portrait I showed you, Vuillard records in his diary that while he and Bonnard were happily reliving their art school days over lunch and discussing the finer points of underpainting, Mart became annoyed, understandably enough, as one can all too easily imagine the scene. But what I take away from Vuillard's passing comment is that Mart was someone who wasn't afraid to speak up. She could obviously hold her own amongst Bonnard's painter friends. When Bonnard and Mart stayed at La Roulotte, their small house at Veronay on the River Seine, they would visit Monet, living nearby at Giverny. On one of these visits, Bonnard made this quick sketch of Mart seated at a dining table next to Monet, both looking very much at ease in each other's company. Mart is not in this photograph, but that's a very nice photograph of Bonnard with Monet. We see Mart on outings with Mayol. Here she is with Bonnard second from the left, with his brother Charles, and Bonnard's niece Yvette, and then Mart. And the two people next, the woman next to her is Hedy Harnloser, of which you will hear quite a lot more. And Mayol is the next figure there, and Dr. Harnloser is the figure there, and kneeling is Mayol's son. Here she is with Matisse, and again in the company of Arthur and Hedy Harnloser. They became very enthusiastic collectors of Bonnard's paintings, and from the time of their first meeting with Bonnard in 1916, became close friends and confidants. At this point, though, I need to refer to a curious, and I have to say, very inconvenient document. It was discovered independently by two researchers, an English academic, Dr. Lucy Whelan, who published her findings in an article in the Burlington magazine in May 2020, and Françoise Cloirac, a painter, writer, and psychoanalyst whose book, L'Indolente, Le Mystère de Marthe Bonnard, was published in 2022. In August 1899, Mart's surviving brother dies, and Mart signs the death certificate. She's registered on the document as Maria Boursin, her real name. But then she's described as femme renard, which means wife. We take to mean that, 29 years old, resident of the Rue Lafayette in Paris. And she signs herself Madame Renard. The inference drawn here by Dr. Whelan is that 5 or 6 years after meeting Bonnard, Mart married a Monsieur Renard. Dr. Whelan argues that even though no marriage certificate has been found, nor any other supporting documentation, nor any further trace of the mysterious Monsieur Renard, a marriage remains a reasonable assumption. Such a marriage shouldn't surprise us in the circumstances, she writes, given the hard conditions of life for women in Mart's position, which left them extremely vulnerable. I actually don't think Mart felt at all vulnerable in the position that she had. She always looks very comfortable, I think. In other words, she is suggesting that Mart swapped the unconventional life she was living with Bonnard for the respectability of marriage. This is all very interesting, but not very convincing, for how on earth was such a marriage kept secret? I think it more likely that finding herself pushed into a rather awkward family situation, that is to say, being asked to sign her brother's death certificate with presumably her mother and sister present, she would have faced a lot of questions about her current life. So she takes an easy way out. She adopts a new identity. She's done it before, and as we discover after her death, she's already told her sister she's living with an artist whose name she doesn't reveal. Maybe She's even hinted that she is now married to this artist. So in order to keep the fiction alive, she invents a phantom husband who will remain untraceable. And by the way, it's possible that her mother was illiterate, and that's why Mart was asked to sign the document along with her sister. And another explanation of why there's no communication between the mother and Mart. And another reason for not believing any marriage took place is that only a couple of years later, around 1902, as we have seen, she's photographed in the company of Bonnard and Bonnard's brother Charles and sister-in-law Eugénie and their children. Moreover, if she had married a Monsieur Renard, she would have had to obtain a divorce before 1925, when she and Bonnard eventually did get married. And we know from the marriage certificate that she married him under her real name, Maria Boursin. As for the name Renard, she may have borrowed it from the well-known novelist Jules Renard, who was a very good friend of Bonnard's, whose book Histoire naturelle, published in 1904, he would illustrate. One of the popular myths about Mart is that she was Bonnard's only model. Even though it's her presence that asserts itself so often in his work, there were always other models. They make an appearance probably as early as 1905 or 1906, when Mart would have been approaching 40. Some, judging from a sheet of drawings of Misha Godebska, this one is 1908, might be close friends. Bonnard made 17 portraits of Misha. She was the glamorous and headstrong wife of Thaddée Natanson, the force behind the literary magazine La Revue Blanche, as well as a great friend and supporter of Bonnard since his early days. Others were professional artist models, such as Anita Champagne, the young girl seen in this striking photo taken by Bonnard around 1916. A photo much admired by Cartier-Bresson, by the way. Bonnard's need for a living presence in the studio never changed. Even after Mart's death in 1942, at least 2 models came regularly to the studio. Dina Vianney, who was Mayol's model, and Muki Vernet, a young girl living locally in La Canée. As we've seen, he always needed the presence of a living model to bring to life the model he had in his head. Models came and went, but in 1916, Bonnard and Mart, now both in their mid to late 40s, befriended 2 young women they'd met in Paris, both of whom would have a major impact on their lives. Lucienne Dupuis de Fresnel, who is seen in this photograph, and Renée Monchatti. Lucienne was 23 years old and married to a doctor with whom she had 1 son. She appears in several paintings, and by all accounts was very popular with Bonnard's wider family. And we see her here strolling by the sea at the spa town of Arcachon. Mart is said to have become particularly friendly with Renée Monchatti, 22 years old and an aspiring artist. Here we see them together in the garden of the Bonnard family house at Le Grand Lens. Both Lucienne and Renée Monchatti became Bonnard's models, and both became his lovers. The affair with Lucienne was probably short-lived and seems to have ended amicably enough, as she continued to see both Bonnard and Mart, which is all the more remarkable as Lucienne's second son, born in 1920, is said on good authority to have been Bonnard's child, and he was named as the child's godparent, which was quite usual in those days. Lucienne divorced her husband in 1924, fell ill with cancer, and died in Cannes in May 1927, aged 36. Mart, so we understand from the Hanlose family, was mostly tolerant of Bonnard's models. But when Bonnard became involved with Renée Monchatti, all that changed. Bonnard is said to have been so enamored with Renée Monchatti that she seriously considered leaving Mart, and here is one of his drawings of her. It's impossible to know the truth of this. Much has been made of the 2 weeks he spent in Rome in March 1921, supposedly with René Montchatty. One writer even suggesting Bonnard had gone to seek the permission of Montchatty's parents to marry. However, the circumstances behind the Rome visit turn out to be rather different from all this speculation. René had gone to Rome, but she'd gone with her then partner, the American painter Harry Lachman. The couple had become very friendly with Bonnard and Mart in Paris, so much so that Harry Lachman invites both Bonnard and Mart to come and stay in the furnished apartment he and Montchatty have rented in Rome. We know this from a postcard Harry Lachman sent Bonnard. The visit gave Bonnard the opportunity to see his nephew Charles, then staying at the French school in Rome. So on the face of it, this trip was innocent enough. Furthermore, Bonnard made no secret of seeing Montchatty. In a postcard to Mart, who had stayed behind in Saint-Tropez, possibly with her friend Berthe Signac, he writes that he has visited what he calls the antiquities in the company of René Montchatty and his nephew Charles, adding that Montchatty would soon be writing to her. What could be more open and transparent? But René Montchatty wasn't just a friend. Margit Hanlöser-Ingold, the granddaughter of Arthur and Hedy Hanlöser, relates how one Sunday matters came to a head. Montchatty was in the studio when the Hanlösers dropped by, as they often did, to inspect Bonnard's recent work. Hedy stayed downstairs to talk to Mart, while Arthur and Bonnard went to join René Montchatty. Suddenly, Mart, in a flash of jealous temper, grabbed a folder of drawings, such as this one imagines, and began furiously tearing them up. Horrified, Hedy ran to fetch the two men, who together managed to calm Mart, and the episode was never referred to again. But Mart's rage is all too understandable. Not only had Bonnard painted several intimate portraits of René, which would have been visible to her and to every visitor to his studio, but he chose to include this pen and ink drawing of her in the 1923 edition of the small monograph on his work by Léon Vert. That wasn't very tactful. Subsequently, the Hanlösers not only befriended René Montchatty, but even seemed to have encouraged her relationship with Bonnard. And as Margaret Hanlöser has put on record, they couldn't prevent the artist from breaking off his relationship with René. My guess is that Bonnard put an end to the affair around 1922. It seems that Montchatty went away for a couple of years, returning to Paris in the summer of 1924, having spent several months in Spain. In a postcard addressed to both Bonnard and Mart, she announces her return in October. It seems she came back to France penniless and out of work, and that Bonnard, as well as the Hanlösers, tried to help her financially. This period of emotional turmoil is reflected in two paintings Bonnard began around 1921, Decoration at Vernon, which you see here, and Young Women in the Garden. Only once before had Bonnard allowed his painting to mirror his emotional life. Man and Woman, 1900, is a portrait of a relationship. It's also a painting that has invited all sorts of interpretations. Robert Rosenblum, the American art historian, saw it as a retelling of the Adam and Eve story. Others have seen it as an expression of the sort of sexual anxiety expressed in the plays of Strindberg and Ibsen, both very popular at the time with Bonnard's literary friends. But what is most striking, though, is the way this bedroom scene is presented as a dramatic narrative. It's easy to see it as a scene from a play or even a still from a film. In this painting, we see the rooted figure of Mart with an attendant figure holding a basket of fruit. And the fruit, we can be sure, has been gathered from the garden at Maroulotte, because this is where the scene is set. The garden, painted with the imaginative freedom of a stage backdrop, gives this painting the air of a theatrical performance. And sure enough, entering stage right comes a blazing Montchati wielding a tennis racket, a gesture that deliberately echoes the gesture of a Greek warrior wielding a sword. Montchati is about to cut down her rival. In the next scene of this emotional drama, Bonnard makes a full disclosure. Here, center stage, is a radiantly smiling Renée Montchati. Mart, or the figure we take to be her, has been literally marginalized on the right, kept apart from her triumphant rival by the back of the wicker chair. The same chair we recognize from the photograph of Mart and Montchati sitting together on the grass at the Bonnard family house in happier times. Bonnard kept this extraordinarily revealing painting in his studio, reworking it during the last years of his life, after Mart had died. What must have been particularly painful for Mart were the portraits, such as this one here, revealing Montchati's all too intimate and loving gaze. No wonder she felt the urge to destroy them. By 1925, Bonnard seems to have decided to put an end to all this emotional upheaval. In August that year, he married Mart in a private civil ceremony in Paris. Her name appears on the marriage certificate as Maria Boursin. No friends were present, and neither they nor his family were informed. The only witnesses were their concierge and her husband. The following month, on the 9th of September, Renée Montchati committed suicide at her home in Paris. The death certificate doesn't record the manner of her death, but it is said she shot herself. According to Tadej Natanson, Bonnard was devastated. A concerned Arthur Hanloser made a special journey from Switzerland to be with him. And what about Mart? Those past few years can't have been easy for her. But at the same time, we begin to see her in a different light. For she had been quietly nursing her own artistic ambitions. The earliest mention we have of Mart's determination to become an artist dates from 1915, when she was already well into her 40s. In a rare surviving letter to her niece Gabrielle, Mart tells her, "I've worked a lot all winter at my drawing, and I'm pleased to tell you that I am on the route to splendor. I will become an artist of value and hope in a year to earn a lot of money." In an earlier communication, she tells Gabrielle about some decorative art she's been doing, and that interests her a lot, she says. But this is the first time we have heard Mart's voice. We know so little about her that it's hard to decide whether she's being serious about her chances of artistic success or a little bit ironic, self-mocking even. But from the optimistic tone of the first letter and from the body of work she went on to produce, it's clear that drawing was much more than a mere hobby. She found an excellent teacher in Louise Hervieux, who you see on the screen here, an established artist well known for her distinctive drawings and pastels. Marthe Bonnard had met Louise Hervieux in 1917 when she was showing her work at the Gallery Bernheim Jeune, which was also Bonnard's gallery, of course. Hervieux was an extremely talented and interesting woman, and extraordinarily courageous. Since childhood, she'd suffered from congenital syphilis, with the result that when she began giving Mart lessons, she had virtually stopped drawing because she was beginning to lose the ability to see color. By 1927, she would be very nearly blind, one of the results of syphilis, of course. But with admirable courage, she took up writing, and that brought her great success. And it's entirely thanks to Hervieux that we catch a glimpse of Mart's personality. This, by the way, is a teaching manual that Louise Hervieux wrote and which Mart would have studied, I'm sure. Because up to now, all we know for certain about Mart is through a few photographs, a few dates, few of which can be corroborated, by the way, and a few anecdotes. And of course, all the paintings and drawings Bonnard made of her, but these that we have seen will tell us very little about what she was like. And we also have to thank Françoise Clairac, that we've mentioned before, whose research led her to Mart's school records. And from these, we learned that she was a clever child, usually coming top of her class. And this is borne out by Louise Hervieux, who was enormously fond of Mart and greatly admired her intelligence and what she recognized as her natural talent. Teaching Mart gave her real pleasure, and she was probably the friend who knew her best. And we see this in a letter she wrote Bonnard in June 1935, by which time both she and Mart were too unwell to see each other anymore. And she writes, "It's with such faithfulness I join my sorrows with those of my dear Mart. I think of her still, laughing and pinching my cheeks and kissing me, just as she did at Molitor." Rue Molitor was their address from about 1917. This letter is followed by a postcard from Mart saying she can't wait to see Louise because she has something really funny to tell her. Now, this is a side of Mart we've not seen before, someone full of fun, perhaps even gossipy, and certainly happy to be around friends. And when I first saw this letter, it brought to mind the way Bonnard paints the young Mart, with a spirited, almost fizzling energy, as though capturing a light-heartedness and spontaneity we might never otherwise guess. Mart's exhibition, her only solo exhibition as it turned out, took place in June 1924 at the prestigious Galerie Drouet in the Rue Royale in Paris. Bonnard had shown then had a big retrospective in April the same year. So was Mart's exhibition a sort of peace offering following the Montchâteau affair? Had Bonnard had some hand in it? Montchâteau had been an aspiring artist, remember, and so could have been seen by Mart as a rival in more ways than one. Or was the timing simply fortuitous? Interestingly, the gallery was now run by the widow of its founder, Alphonse Eugène Drouet, and maybe Madame Drouet was particularly open to showing a woman artist. Mart, unsurprisingly, adopted a new surname for the occasion, signing her work Marthe Solange, so as to distance herself from Bonnard, who by now was extremely well known. Solange was the name of her maternal grandmother, and I find it interesting that she didn't think this might be the time to use her real name. "It seems that she has never been so well," was Bonnard's comment on Mart's exhibition, and this is borne out by a photograph of Mart standing behind two of her works, looking straight at the camera, confident and self-assured. Favorable press notices, together with the sale of over 25 works, showed the exhibition to have been a success. I'm just going to show you some of the works in that exhibition. They were all done, apparently, from around 1922, and you will note, I'm sure, that these whole series of work she showed were done while Bonnard was having his affair with René Montchâteau. We know from another letter to Hedy Harmleser, that Bonnard was both pleased and relieved by the positive response to Mart's exhibition. He told her, "All has gone very well, and success has rewarded us for all this effort." And he adds, "Artists were very surprised by something new and at the same time solid." He is said to have exclaimed in front of one of Mart's pastels, What gifts, if only I could do as much. This could come across as hugely patronizing, but his admiration, I'm sure, was completely genuine and even tells us something important about his own work. One of the reasons Bonnard had such admiration for Matisse was expressed in a letter he wrote to the painter in 1940. When I think of you, I think of a mind cleansed of every old aesthetic convention, and it is that alone that allows a direct view of nature, the greatest joy that can befall a painter. His own struggle to overcome the conventions learned at art school was always at the front of his mind. The quality he admired in Matisse was surely the quality he recognized in Mart's pastels, a freedom from those conventions and a freedom from any pretense. I always wondered why a Picasso painting of 1941 had such a prominent position on the wall of his studio. You can see it up there at the top. It seems so unlikely a choice, given that every image he had pinned to his studio wall can be traced back to the enthusiasms of his early years. But in fact, the Picasso makes perfect sense. In Bonnard's mind, both Picasso and Matisse had cleansed their art, so to speak, of aesthetic conventions and had achieved a directness and honesty he admired above all else. And he surely recognized something of that directness in Mart's pastels, a way of looking and working untroubled by received ideas and the restraints of an art school education. But why should Bonnard have been so relieved at Mart's success? Many of those who knew her were beginning to notice her gradual withdrawal into herself and the beginnings of an extreme distrust, or was it fear, of social contact, particularly when it involved Bonnard's old and very dear painter friends, such as Vuillard and Matisse. As Mart's mental and physical health has become a rather contentious subject, as well as the cause of much speculation, let's look at what we actually know. After the death of René Montchâty in 1925 and of Lucienne Dupuy de Fresnel in 1927, we see less and less of Marthe. It's around this date, when she was approaching 50, that she starts to withdraw from her old life and her old friends. The only photograph I know of her later than 1927 is the one in this passport she acquired in 1938, when she and Bonnard were thinking they might have to leave France if war broke out. By 1930, things had gone badly downhill. Bonnard writes to his old friend, the art critic Georges Besson. For quite some time now, I've been living a very secluded life, as Mart has become completely unsociable, and I'm obliged to avoid all contact with other people. I have hopes, though, that this state of affairs will change for the better, but it is rather painful. And in January 1932, he confides to his fellow painter, Maurice Denis, that Mart is still totally misanthropic. This may get better, but it means great isolation for me, as the only remedy is to live in isolation. I have time to pursue my questions concerning painting techniques, and I pick my olives. A month or so later, Bonnard writes to their friend Bert Signac, who is planning to visit them. Mart has become totally misanthropic. She no longer wants to see anyone, not even old friends. If you come, she has to think it's by chance, and perhaps she will see you. And in 1936, writing to Hedy Hahnlöser, Bonnard confides, I was very happy to hear from you. I often think of you. Believe me when I say that this enforced solitude is hard, and it's the only possible remedy. Far from the world, peace and quiet have returned. It sometimes seems to me to be over, and then a word lets me know that the old phobia is still there. Letters such as these, all from Bonnard himself, leave no doubt about the nature and the severity of Mart's mental health and the toll it took on them both. It can't have been easy for such a private person as Bonnard to confide in his friends, but as meeting up with them had become so difficult, he had no choice. The last of his letters I quoted from is the one I find most touching, Bonnard's remark that just when he thinks Mart might be getting better, a word lets me know that the old phobia is still there. It doesn't take much imagination to understand what it must have been like to live with that sort of constant watchfulness and anxiety. As to the phobia Bonnard refers to, we can only guess it was some sort of paranoia. It is said that she was fearful his friends were out to steal his secrets, which would explain why very close painter friends, like Vuillard, found themselves no longer welcome. Bonnard's friend Georges Besson was in no doubt that Mart suffered from tuberculosis for 30 years and from some nervous disorder for at least half that time. Others believe she suffered from severe asthma. There were no reliable cures for either. Before the widespread use of penicillin, the only remedies for respiratory ailments as serious as those were bed rest, careful attention to hygiene and various diets, and visits to the many spas and sanatoria dotted around France. And it's also worth pointing out that the authors of A History of Tuberculosis Before 1940, that is, before the discovery of penicillin, of course, published in France in 1983, refer to what is known as la folie tuberculose, symptoms of which were mood swings, extreme irritability, feelings of persecution. Other sources indicate that tuberculosis can act as a risk factor for mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, delusions. Regular visits to spas were one way of alleviating Mart's respiratory ailments. And as I mentioned earlier, a plumbed-in bath was the one luxury they had installed in their houses, both at La Roulotte and Le Bosquet at Le Canet. As I mentioned earlier, Bonnard often refers to the art of the past when treating the subject of the nude. He gave Lucien Dupuy de Fresnel the pose of the dying Niobe, and in earlier paintings, he had transposed his nudes into various classical poses, such as the famous hermaphrodite in the Louvre, the crouching Aphrodite, of which you have a beautiful example here in the Kimball collection, or the Medici Venus. But what he'd never attempted before was a nude lying flat, horizontal to the picture plane. So I want us to think about this painting of 1925, the first of the four great bath paintings, not as Mart in the bath, but as a way of bringing the subject of the nude into the modern world. New because the image of a nude lying fully horizontal is very uncommon. Odalisques are portrayed lying down, but usually supported by an elbow in order to look out at the painting and to engage the viewer. When Maurice Denis painted the horizontally placed nude seen behind the figure of Lucien Dupuy de Fresnel, a painting that Bonnard owned, this is the Maurice Denis behind, the Denis painting must have seemed pretty radical. Was the bath Bonnard's response to Maurice Denis' nude? Typically, Bonnard chooses to frame his subject in the most obvious place for a modern nude to be. The analogy between the white enamel bath and a marble sarcophagus has been made by more than one art historian, myself included, but I want to take it one step further. Bonnard was always eyeing the art of the past. Remember René Montchâty portrayed as a Gallic warrior. And my hunch is that when considering a painting such as this, he was not only consciously taking on Maurice Denis' painting, but perhaps a subject going far back in time and popular since Byzantine times, the Dormition of the Virgin. The Dormition, a well-known image in Christian iconography, represents the belief that the Virgin Mary fell into an eternal sleep, a kinder and gentler reflection on death, and one which I think is closer to the subject of the bath, because this painting, with its utterly compelling stillness, is surely about the transitory nature of being, in other words, an elegy. But for whom? Bonnard was greatly affected by several deaths around this time. In the summer of 1923, his brother-in-law Claude Terrasse had died, shortly followed by the death of his beloved sister André. He felt this double loss deeply. Then 2 years later, Renée Montchatty takes her own life. As we know, Bonnard painted very slowly and over time, so I cannot agree with those who suggest the bath was painted as a requiem slowly for Montchatty. The canvas was surely begun much earlier than September 1925, when Montchatty died, because it was shown at the Salon d'Automne that year. And another death was approaching, that of his friend and neighbor, Claude Monet. And I don't think it too exaggerated to suggest that Bonnard's own experiment with the floating world of the bathroom might be a homage to Monet's floating world of his water lilies, a series of paintings Bonnard knew extremely well from his visits to Monet over the years. For instance, we know that in the summer of 1916, Monet invited him to Giverny, especially to look at his recent canvases of water lilies. And now, in 1925, when Bonnard was paying his last visits to the ailing Monet, who was dying of lung cancer, was he also paying his last respects through painting? He may also have had a memory of Monet's painting of his first wife, Camille, on her deathbed, with its watery image of a life ebbing away. Bonnard often shifts from moods of calm reflection to moods of exuberance and exaltation. When I look at the 3 late bath paintings, which you are so fortunate to have here, because they are not lent that often. And here they are bathed in the glimmering richness of color found in Byzantine mosaics. I see not only their splendor, but also the gravity and the profound meditative quality of great religious imagery. That is why I suggest that the subject may have been sparked by the strikingly horizontal format of a Byzantine or early Italian Dormition, such as the one on the screen, which is by Pietro Cavallini and is found in Santa Maria in Trastevere in Rome, where Bonnard might have seen it on his visit to Rome in 1921. Primitive painters, Bonnard once said, understood the importance of richness of effect, for they derived their brightest reds and blues from precious colorings, lapis lazuli, gold, and cochineal. Modest Bonnard may have been, but he wanted his paintings to have the weight, and that's his word, weight, of the old masters. And I suspect that he wanted these late bath paintings to have the jeweled magnificence of Byzantium. Mart died from a cardiac arrest on the 26th of January 1942. She had been more or less confined to her room for some years before that, and the privations of the war years can't have helped. Her life with Bonnard had begun with a fabrication, a seemingly harmless deception about her name, her age, and her family circumstances, but it was to have consequences that she could never have imagined. Bonnard had always avoided bureaucracy of any sort, and was therefore shocked to discover 6 months after Mart's death, that he was facing a large fine for failing to pay the tax due on her estate. She'd never made a will, which meant that everything Bonnard owned was subject to the division of assets required under French law for couples who had not made a marriage contract, which they hadn't. This meant that Bonnard's house in La Canée and his studio in Paris would be sealed until a full inventory could be made of their contents and Mart's share evaluated. I will cut this long story short. Baffled by bureaucracy, Bonnard engages a local lawyer who advises him to fake Bonnard's will, leaving him everything, This is done, and the problem goes away. Bonnard dies on the 22nd of January, 1947. A few years later, his deception is discovered. A search is made by lawyers for Mart's heirs, and her nieces are found. They discover their aunt has been married to Bonnard, and they learn what they stand to gain. And so the lawsuits begin. We are now in 1952, and another 10 years will go by until the case is finally settled. One positive thing to come out of this protracted legal fight is that the law has changed. The judge rules that an artist's production should no longer be considered part of the property held in common with a spouse. So that's Mart's doing. But the real victim of this 10-year courtroom drama was Bonnard's reputation. In those vital years between his death in 1947 and 1962, the majority of the great late works were hidden away in the Paris branch of the Chase Manhattan Bank. He had left 600 oils, 500 gouaches and watercolors, and 5,000 drawings. As a result, at a time when the canon of 20th century art was being established chiefly by the admirers of Picasso and Matisse, Bonnard was more or less ignored. During those crucial years between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1960s, he was widely seen as having brought nothing of great importance to painting. As Christian Zervos, the great champion of Picasso, had no shame in telling Matisse, Bonnard's role between Impressionism, you, and Cubism amounts to nothing. I want to leave you with two images of Mart, the small oil that Bonnard painted in 1893 and a gouache of 1941, perhaps his final image of her. In both works, Mart is shown proffering a cup of tea or coffee. Knowing Bonnard's love of Greek and Roman art, we recognize this gesture from ancient artifacts, such as this one here. But it's also a gesture that is found in the bowl of milk, where, dressed as a Greek chore, Mart holds out a small bowl as though making a votive offering. A votive offering is a gift. So should we read the same gesture in the painting of 1893 as Mart offering him the gift of herself? And Bonnard's repetition of this same gesture in 1941 as Mart advances towards him, now a wisp of a figure, glimpsed through doors that seem to be closing in on her. Should we read this as a grateful acceptance of all she had brought to him and to his art? For my part, I read this gouache as a loving acknowledgement of her importance to him and a final farewell. Thank you.